Once again, I am delighted to be able to welcome Noah Askin to this series. We'll be talking about the social foundations of creative influence. Noah is a computational social scientist and sociologist, and an associate professor of organization and management at the Paul Mirage School of Business at UCI Irvine. He conducts research on social and cultural networks, the causes and consequences of creativity, particularly in the music industry, the production and consumption of culture, and the dynamics of organizational and individual status. He's particularly interested in the creative process, its outcomes, and the forces that influence it. And so his work sits squarely in all of the different areas that we've been discussing this week and we'll be also discussing tomorrow. So without any more delay, I'll give the floor to Noah. At the end of his talk, there'll be plenty of time for conversation and for questions. Noah, welcome.
All right. Thanks, Tim. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
There you go. Thank you. So first, thank you, Tim, Lily, for organizing, Tim, for having me. I feel a little out of my element here, just having watched the last talk. It was very technically savvy, and I'm much more applied. So you'll bear with me on the model related conversation, which will be relatively minimal. But this is you'll see that I take a very sociological lens to the work that I do. That is my background, and just by way of background of this particular paper and project. Just quick, who's a PhD student? Okay, to give you hope in sometimes hopeless world. This project has been something that have been working on for about a decade now. The original version of this paper had R&Rs at 3 of the top journals in sociology and management. Didn't get past the second round, and now we're back to the drawing board. So I guess hold out hope? Question mark is sort of the lesson I want to give you there. Also, this is work that I'm doing with Eric Contain, who is at ESMT in Berlin, and Yuri Moll, who's in Melbourne, trying to organize a collective Zoom call with the two of them is damn near impossible, given the time zone differences. So, social foundation of creative influence. I like to go with nice and understated titles. I don't think anybody would deny the fact that, of course, there is social influence that takes place in the creative process. And the question is, can we get a little bit better sense of what that might look like? And can we then test that empirically? And so situating the research, amongst all of the work that I do, just to give you a little introduction to myself, the definition that we use in the social sciences coming from Teresa Amable at Harvard of creativity is a process of generating something novel and that is deemed useful and or appropriate for a given audience. And so I kind of use that as a little bit of a frame for the work that I do. The papers in green are those that are published. The ones that are in white are those that are sort of lingering in the ether somewhere. So this is about the process of creativity. How do groups stay together over time and maintain their creative juices? This one is a very theoretical strategy paper, which is way outside of my league, but we're trying it anyway. How do you generate something novel? So that's a little bit of what we're going to be talking about here today. It's also work that I've done looking at where genre innovation comes from, also looking at gender differences in creativity in the music industry, and then useful or appropriate. How is creativity received, and how do tastes change depending on geographical location, how much people are changing their routines. And so the data predominantly come from either Spotify, purchased company Echo Nest, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And that's music data, actual songs, features, the acoustic features of songs. That's a big bulk of the data that I use. And then I have a pretty large data set from Deezer, which is another one of the big streaming platforms, predominantly based in France and Europe, although they are global, that looks at listening habits and how people's listening habits change as they break their routines. And what does that mean? International travel, but also COVID lockdowns. And so we had a paper, with my PhD student, Quan Kim, and with James Evans, who some of you probably know, through the PNAS a couple years ago. So that's kind of situating the work that I do. For our purposes here today, any way we can hit OK on that, just so I can have some sense of where we're going.
Yeah.
Is that on mine? Is that my
on yours? Yes. Oh. Great idea.
I wrote these nice titles. I might as well get them. Okay.
It is.
There we go. Great success. Okay. So as far as what has the literature said over time, very high level, right? You could obviously spend a lot of time diving into this, and we do more so in the paper, as far as where creative inspiration or creative influence comes from. Right, unsurprisingly, a lot of the early work on this in psychology tends to focus on individual level capabilities, differences, skills, etc. And so there's a whole line of research about what differentiates creative people and where and how they get inspired. But of course, there is now increasing recognition and plenty of research that talks about collective action, collaboration, social structure in helping, shape the creative process. Okay. Also, just logistical aside, I did my PhD at Chicago, where the explicit purpose of giving talks is to try to make the speaker cry with your comments and feedback. So if you want to chime in with questions or attack me personally, it's nothing I haven't seen before. You should feel free to jump in with questions at any point. So collective action, social structure, and those, although these are coming from different fields of study, that scholars generally have kind of narrowed in on two specific mechanisms by which creative inspiration takes place. And what do those two look like? Okay, so there's one field, one view that's kind of sociological, that's network-based, that comes from innovation studies, that suggests it's the structure of the collaboration network. Connecting with diverse ideas, connecting with diverse others. These tend to provide more recombinatory material that is able, if you're able to, as an individual or a team, to kind of productively work with that, leads to more creative output. Okay, obviously that's that massive condensing of a very deep and broad literature, but that's the general gist. Okay, so that's one kind of mechanism, is this recombination. The other mechanism, right, from social psychology and our intuition, suggests that some aspect of collaboration that is beyond the recombinatory material has to provide some kind of inspiration or influence, right? Think about co-authors. Yes, they're bringing their knowledge and their background and the different field perspectives and the work that they've done, but something about working with somebody who is inspiring or who is particularly creative or who is able to look at things from a slightly different perspective and pushes you as an individual to be more creative, to be more thoughtful, to dive a little deeper. So working with other creative people surely has an influence of its own that is separate from, certainly connected to, the recombinatory material perspective, and some kind of creative stimulation, we're calling it stimulation or inspiration, beyond the diverse ideas that those other people provide access to. Okay, I don't think that's particularly controversial, but if it is, let me know. So the two mechanisms make sense, but that only tells part of the story. Recombination and stimulation tend to rely on some sort of direct collaboration, some contact that can be picked up and measured, whether it's with another person, whether it's with another idea or a book or a concept, right, from network science. So what influence, positive or negative, does the cultural context or do cultural norms exert on creativity that may not be fully captured by direct connections? That's fundamentally what we're trying to understand here. And so the cultural context, and in music and in other artistic endeavors as well, we think about genre. Okay, there are norms, there are boundaries, there are different people that play in genres, there are audience expectations. And so, what kind of influence does categorical affiliation, right, in this case, artist genre assignments, because it also determines the boundaries of creative output, both what's allowed, what's not allowed, where people can push boundaries, how broad or narrow they can afford to be, and that determines a lot of creative output. What's the cultural context into which people can be creative or not? And so even without interacting in all of the other artists in a genre, they all, meaning the genres and the people in them, along with audiences and industry gatekeepers, constitute a cultural context that shapes creative production. Okay, and so genres act as repositories of stylistic elements. That's recombination, sure, and they provide inspiration, identity, belonging, evaluative standards, boundaries, expectations, etc. That's where kind of stimulation comes in. Okay, so if you take these ideas together, you've got two mechanisms, and you've got two spheres of influence. And we can take an example from Bob Dylan. Okay, so you have Bob Dylan's Nashville Skyline, 1969. He went to Nashville and decided that he was going to record a pure country album. And he played on that album with Johnny Cash, who also wrote the liner notes. You'll note there on the back of the vinyl. He played with Chris Christopherson. He played with Charlie Daniels. And the question is, was playing with those guys, how did they exert influence? Was it they were bringing the different material and the understandings of the different genre conventions with them? Was it the fact that they themselves were inspiring? Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash had a friendship that went back. So was it something about just performing with these other inspiring people? So that's a question of direct collaboration. And then the source of influence being either stimulation from working with these creative others or recombination. Fast forward, you've got Bob Dylan and bringing it all back home, which was his first kind of crossover into rock. And yes, on that particular album, he performed with a rock band. But what was it that sort of inspired him to make the switch in the first place? Yes, you could argue it was people that he encountered, but it was also things in the ether and the constraints that he felt he faced in the folk genre that encouraged him to experiment and explore. And so we can't necessarily trace it specifically to an individual, what they brought to the table. There's lots of apocryphal stories, as most things with Bob Dylan can't get the actual truth. It's stories about what was it that inspired him to make the move into rock. And his understanding of what rock looked like came from his exposure to genre norms and expectations, but also other people like the Beatles and Eric Burdon and the Animals and others who were inspiring too. So you can think about direct collaboration influencing the way that you created a country album, also relevant here, but beyond that, what was going on in the genres, both of folk and of rock music, that was kind of inspiring him as well. That's the kind of an illustrative example of what I'm talking about here. So two mechanisms, two spheres of influence. The recombination of diverse material, and then the stimulation / inspiration, and two spheres, the social or collaborative sphere from network science, and then a cultural sphere. And so we have a 2x2 that we're going to explore in greater depth. And so this is kind of an abductive bit of research in that we had some inclinations around what are the different ways in which people have looked at creativity and tried to examine it empirically. And then how can we then take these, kind of create this 2x2 framework for thinking about it, and then start to explore, all right, what's going on as far as creative influence here. And you can see, so in the social sphere, recombination is the direct ties creative content and material, meaning the genres they're associated with. The stimulation is their creative influence, right? What have they done previously, and how does that influence a current song? And then from the cultural or genre sphere, it's the other people in the genres. What material do they have access to based on the other genres that they're a part of? Or it's the creative inspiration and constraint. And I'll explain how we operationalize that in just a little bit. The question so far? Good. Explained it 100% clearly. So our research question: what can we say about the creative influence coming from each of these cells in the 2x2? And what can we say about how they work or inhibit each other in tandem? That's the general gist. And more broadly, how can we better understand then the nature of creative influence by considering these pathways and interactions? That's what we're aiming for here. So the empirical setting and the data. Global music industry, it's much like stories about Bob Dylan. It's very difficult to get a specific number on the size of the music industry because it all depends on what you are considering as far as where revenue is coming from. Total revenue of recorded music is about 40 billion worldwide. About 250 million plus paying Spotify subscribers these days. The data is 1955 to 2000. Why stop in 2000? Well, January 2001, which is very convenient for data purposes, is when iTunes was launched. And so the ability to direct publish music at that point became much more reasonable. Now, we have data beyond that, but what happens is you actually start to see stuff that gets published that didn't go through any kind of typical record label. That opens up opportunities and doors. It also means there's lots more garbage out there too. And so for our purposes, at least as we're testing this early on, is looking at, okay, what had to have gone through some particular process in the music industry with some gatekeeper that said there must be a market for this somewhere. Because if we're going to be talking about creativity and specifically using novelty as our measure of creativity, we want to be able to say something that novelty has some relevance to an audience somewhere. Once iTunes launches and more direct publishing comes on, that relevance starts to get a little bit shadier, but it's something we're continuing to build on as this project continues to advance. So that's why the stop in 2000. We have song and artist level data. Given that this is a multimodal cultural analytics workshop, I can talk to you a little bit about the sources of data. Anybody familiar with music information retrieval as a field? Okay, it's nice to speak to an audience that's heard that before. That's fun. So the Echo Nest was started by 2 machine learning PhDs from MIT, and they wanted to understand, this is about 15, 20 years ago, they wanted to be able to capture the known realm of music through machine learning algorithms, and they created a company called the Echo Nest, which basically takes in music, and it actually examines it down to pretty much each beat of any given song. You feed it, and then we'll give you back the beat by beat readout of what's going on in that beat, but then it also creates kind of song level metrics. And I'll show you what some of the variables are here. Create song level metrics that capture the acoustic features of that particular song. And then of course, over time, as it builds more and more songs in there, it's relative. And so you'll see some of the features that they have. Some of them, if you have any familiarity with music theory, will look very familiar to you. Some of them are what we might consider more subjective measures of what a song sounds like. And what this was able to do was capture the known world of music as they added more and more songs to it. And it enabled Echo Nest, which was bought by Spotify in 2014, to compare songs to each other. Which are more similar, which are more differentiated. And so a lot of the recommendation algorithms at Spotify were created as some combination of collaborative filtering. If I like song A, B, C, and D, and Tim likes songs C, D, and E, I might like song E, collaborative filtering.
I only like the acoustic version of C.
There you go. Well, fair enough. And so collaborative filtering is very common as far as recommendation engines. However, it is also filtered through the acoustic features. So not only is it, which are similar, Spotify's recommending songs not only based on what's similar in terms of listening patterns, but what's similar in terms of acoustic features. Okay, so in 2013, 14, I taught myself how to interface with an API. I didn't know what that meant back then. And I bombarded the hell out of the Echo Nest's API. I got a cease and desist very quickly, but they were actually very kind, and they took pity on a sad, lost PhD student and said, you can ping the API, just chill out a little, okay? And so they were kind enough to, and I was fortunate enough to be able to get access to basically the entire data set that they had at the time. They were subsequently, a year later, bought by Spotify. Spotify API made it available, that data, for quite a while. They made it a lot harder to get, and as of last year, gone. It exists in the ether somewhere, and on servers that I have some access to. So Echo Nest is the song and artist level data. Music Brains is an online collaborative music encyclopedia with all kinds of metadata connected to the relatively complete is an overstatement, but a very vast subset of the known world of music. And it is audience driven, but it is sort of expert checked, if you will. And they kind of update their structure every once in a while, but you can access all of that data. It's a plus. Overall, in the data set that I ultimately collected, it's 20 million songs, 2 million artists. And for this, again, because of the nature of the time frame there, we are looking at about 613,000 songs. AI companion, huh? You'd like that, wouldn't you? Okay. And about 25,000 artists and groups. That's the data we're here. So what are the sonic attributes? Like I said, if you have any kind of familiarity with music and music theory at all, the top several are quite familiar. Tempo, what key is it in? Is it major or minor? The time signature. And then you get into kind of the more secret sauce for the echo nest, a little bit more of the subjective nature of what listening to a particular song might do for you as a listener. You've got the valence, like the musical positivity. You've got how danceable a song is. You've got the acousticness, how likely it is to be sort of acoustic people, human beings recording versus more electronic production. You've got energy. Energy, think about like hard rock, heavy metal being super high on energy. It's not necessarily how loud, but sort of more about intensity, if you will. You've got liveness, whether or not there's a live audience. You have to remember there's a lot of recorded music that is taken with a live audience. So they want to understand how likely is this to have been studio produced versus live. And then speechiness. You can imagine hip hop tends to be very high on speechiness. Classical music, very low. Samir.
Yeah, just a quick question. Given that Spotify made these data,
Yeah.
why do you think like this?
So I actually did with, it was earlier models, so I'm sure that it's gotten better. So I asked for some acoustic features for like Beatles music. And I had to have sort of a back and forth to get it to give me anything approximating what I was interested in. And at the time, it was like unsatisfactory. I have not gone back to the well to see where it is now. I also haven't fed it songs directly, which is probably something we should do. But yeah, as of about 8 months ago, it was not great. Yeah.
Most of these make sense. I know this is echo, that's not you, but how do you take a musical key and express it in 0 to 1 or like major or minor?
Yeah. So the musical key was actually not. We actually condensed that for our purposes.
Okay.
Major or minor, we just make binary.
Okay.
That makes sense. So yeah, we try in an attempt to collapse. Actually, the way that we did key was binary for each individual key. So there's whatever there are 11 keys. Yeah. So you've got each is a 0 to 1 depending on which one it's in. Now, are there songs that have multiple keys? There certainly are. So this, if you have, even if like I'm a music fan, that's why I wanted to study this. And so seeing this and recognizing that this is like a song is captured in these features is a little dispiriting, I guess, to put it mildly. But obviously what you lose in depth, you pick up in scale. So they're trade-offs like anything. And just to drive this point home, anybody want to tell me what song that is? It's from 1989. I'd say some of you were born then, not all of you. I mean, who doesn't know? What's 0.49 in energy? Come on.
Janet Jackson.
Good guess. Very close.
Wow.
Very close.
The vectors.
I can't believe you didn't know that wasn't Madonna's Like a Prayer. I mean, come on. So, right, you can sense what gets lost by looking at it in this particular way. Okay. So I don't think I need to explain dimensional embedding to this group, but this is taking a random sample of 10,000 songs. It's obviously relayered on the genre data. So what's interesting, Spotify used additional machine learning algorithms to basically understand musical genres from a combination of existing text and also musical similarity. And so there's a website which has stopped being updated called Every Noise at Once. If you want to lose an entire day of your life going down a music genre rabbit hole, I'm a little remiss to do that while I'm giving a talk, but have at it if you have to. Every Noise at Once, which is basically a two-dimensional, or it's a two-dimensional map of all the genres that Spotify, the machine learning algorithms by their head of data kind of came up with. And when he stopped updating it, I think they were at about 1,500 genres, give or take. And so what we did is we mapped those to about 43 parent genres. And so you can see some of the more popular ones here. What does this show you? Music, obviously across popular-ish categories, tends to sound similar. The divisions, I'm pretty sure, are a function of the key, of what key it's in, right? So you can see that, and you can see things like, hip hop kind of exists a bit on an island of its own. You've got rock music, it's sort of the purple, it's kind of scattered across different keys. Red is jazz, it kind of exists a little bit in odd places. But yeah.
I'm just curious because we have like jazz and soul and blues, but we don't have like CP electronic. And electronic would be like folk.
So in this there is electronic in the data set. In this particular random sampling, I think we probably wanted to get ones that ultimately looked a little bit closer to each other. I suspect I would have to look into that to remember exactly what our conversion looked like, but electronic is one of the parent genres. I just didn't grab that for this particular visualization. Yeah. Okay. Creating a dependent variable. If we're looking at creative influence, how is it that we capture creativity? And so the creative process obviously leads to some creative output, and the level of creativity, as we're defining it, is about song novelty. Okay, how novel is a song vis-a-vis some other comparison set? This is similar to some variables that I've used in other work that I've done and published. And so how do we construct that? So we take a comparison set for a given song. For our main analyses, we use a 10-year rolling window. So the songs that were released in the 10 years prior, we've run it with 1 year, 5 years, 1, 2, 5, and then no time, basically back to the beginning of the data set. Doesn't change things all that much, which is, I guess, encouraging. We calculate a feature distance. We use cosine similarity between a given song and whatever other song, every single other song in that window. We then aggregate that distance and create a song level novelty score. And then we scale it to 1 to 100. And then take the log for our regressions, and you'll see why in a slide or two. Our formulation of novelty is basically aligned with the understandings of musical preferences, which tend to be preferences have been shown to be associated with kind of high level musical features, okay, like speed, repetition, sadness, loudness, a lot of the features that we have in our data set. This is what the distribution looks like, and you see why we take the log transformation. A lot of music based on 10 summary features tends to kind of look similar, sound similar. And of course, there's pretty wide variance, as you might imagine as well, especially as you consider the fact that while it does skew Western, there is a pretty wide range of music that, there's music from all over the world, different genres, different micro genres. Like one of the genres, if you go on Every Noise at Once, is like, like Polish hip hop is like a genre that's in there. And then Polish traditional, those two things are going to sound quite different. And so you have some songs that are more novel than others. What does it look like over time? It's hard to say anything really meaningful considering all of the different types of music that are in the data set. I just think it's kind of interesting to come up with ex post theories as to why the early 80s or mid 80s were like a sad era for the creativity of music. But our data suggests that was the case. Obviously, the 60s, as there was an explosion of electric means of recording, there was an explosion of creativity, and then kind of dwindles, and then bounces back up as you start seeing new genres pop up in the mainstream. You start seeing hip hop and kind of a proliferation of genres that took place kind of throughout the 80s, but then hit the mainstream as moved into the 90s and beyond. Yeah.
What's the time window again?
1955 to 2000.
No, but for each slice, how far right can you compare it to?
10 years.
Okay.
Yeah. Obviously, up until 1960, you're only going back 5 years because 1955 is where the data started. So that might have a little bit of bias coming from fewer songs to be compared to. Okay, some examples. What pops up as the upper end of novelty? Shine On You Crazy Diamond, parts 1 through 5, to those Floyd heads in the crowd. La Di Da Di by Slick Rick, one of the early popular hip hop songs. And then Everything in Its Right Place, which, as a big Radiohead fan, I'm very happy to see that. Justify my own music, my own research, of course. And similarly, for the lower end of novelty, Phil Collins, Take Me Home, not very high novelty. You won't be surprised to know the Backstreet Boys not crushing it in the novelty category. Which song is that? Hold on, I wrote down which song specifically.
They're all interchangeable.
Right, As Long As You Love Me. I know there's a lot of Backstreet Boy fans here, so I see some of you wearing white today. I know. And then Sheryl Crow, A Change Will Do You Good, pops up as sort of falling on the lower end of song novelty, which, again, yes, I absolutely selected these, but it's interesting to see the songs that do and don't necessarily pop up in our data as being more or less novel. Okay, so how do we then operationalize our independent variables? How do we find the alters that we're using both as genre, contributing from the cultural and genre perspective, and of course from the collaborative perspective? So our social sphere, right, the collaboration network, includes active artists, right, who shared at least one track credit with a focal artist in the decade prior to the focal song release. Okay, and they must be active, having released one song during that period. Okay, so anybody that we have access to all of the collaborators on each individual song through music frames, and we can then see what else they recorded on, what else they were a part of. We can capture their individual level creativity based on the songs they were a part of. For the cultural sphere, genre sphere, active artists sharing at least one genre affiliation. So the way that the Echo Nest assigns genres is a little bit, unfortunately, through the at the artist level. It's not at the song level. But what it does is it gives a weight to each genre assignment, to each artist. And each artist has at least one genre that has a score of 1. And then if they are associated with other genres, it's usually to a lesser extent. And so you'll see some weighting that's given to each genre affiliation. And so anything above 0.5, we've included as, the artist is associated with that genre. And so we pull the active artists that also share in that genre for a focal artist. And then, we don't have any requirement here for any personal interaction. This is any other artist that shared a genre affiliation during the time frame. Some key design choices. The alter sets are dynamic. They're recalculated for each song at the time it was released. And so even on an album where, it's a single artist, you're going to have different collaborators on the different songs from any of them. So each time it's recalculated. And like I said, 10-year rolling windows for both collaboration and song output.
So
yes.
Just a quick question. How many of these active artists who share at least one track credit, I'm thinking of someone like, what was his name, Chuck Legal or something like that, played with the Allman Brothers and the Rolling Stones, kind of a studio artist. How many studio artists do you wind up picking up in this?
I don't have the answer to that question. What actually much more common than guys who've performed on 2,000 tracks. So the band Toto, you're all familiar with the song Africa, aka the greatest song ever written. The guys from Toto are session musicians. And so they're actually, many of them are credited on thousands of songs. That's an extreme anomaly out the right tail. In fact, most artists have one credit to their name. The modal output is a single album for most artists in general. And so therefore the modal collaboration is 0. And so actually we have an imputation strategy specifically because there were a lot of zeros in that particular category. But yes, I don't know in general, but I think that number is a lot smaller than the number of people that put out one album and then became something totally unrelated to music. Okay, so how do we create these IVs? Remember, this is the 2x2 that we're looking at. So for recombination, we pull the prior collaborators, or for the genre measures, for the cultural sphere, the genre peers, right? All of the other people that appear in the same genre. For the focal artists at the time of release, we then identify all the unique genres associated with the collaborators or the genre peers. Remember, recombination is about what recombinatory material you have access to. We then compute the sum of distances between the pairwise combinations of genres. And genre distance is a function, it's the inverse of the frequency of co-occurrence between all genres in the data set, basically getting how distant are the genres that an individual or their collaborators or their genre peers are a part of. And then we normalize it by dividing by the maximum sum, trying to get a sense of how diverse is the material that an individual artist has access to, either as a function of the people they play with directly or the people who are in the same genre that they're a part of. Stimulation or inspiration, we take the same set of collaborators, we identify all prior songs that each collaborator released or was a part of in the prior 10 years. We then calculate the average song novelty for each collaborator or all of the songs in the affiliated genres. So all of the genre peers, right? So if I'm an artist and I'm in pop and rock and electronic, We'll pull all of the artists that are in those 3 genres, and we'll collect all of the songs they released during that window. We'll create an average of the song creativity, that song novelty, and then we'll average it into that single variable that gives us this for each song. That's a function of, all right, what level of creativity are my collaborators bringing to this particular song? What level of creativity exists in the genres that I'm a part of up to the point of that given song? Okay? Okay. The control variables that we use decade dummies. We've looked at this also, we've used format dummies. So what is the prevailing format, most popular format? You can talk about vinyl, you can talk about 8-track, cassette, CD. Some of you might know what vinyl and 8-track are. Decade is also a way that music historians tend to look at musical trends over time. Doesn't make a whole lot of difference. And so just for our purposes, we use decade dummies. We look at gender/bands. We look at genre dummies, especially for classical and jazz, because the structure of the music is so different. It often pops up as being quite novel. We've also run tests where we don't include classical and jazz at all. The prior creativity of the focal artist, right? We want to know what their individual endowment that they're bringing to the table. Artist productivity, right? If you want to have a good idea, have lots of ideas. That's Linus Pauling. So there's a function of creativity and novelty. That's a function of, do you just crank out a lot of stuff? How long the artist has been performing, whether or not they're charting. As you might imagine, if you're trying to appeal to a popular audience, your degree of novelty tends to be lower in general. Whether or not they're part of a major label, greater marketing, also some forces that drive you to be less creative, less novel. The number of genres spans, so we want to have it be not just a function of what does the artist have access to, but what do they get from their genres, but what are they getting from the people that they perform with, and then the number of active collaborators to make sure that's not being skewed, just the simple fact that they're playing with it. Correlation matrix, you can kind of see the things that are connected to each other, right? The tenure, number of years that someone's been performing is how much, obviously correlated pretty highly with how many songs they put out before. Unsurprising. The 2 of interest to us in particular are these 2 up here. So cultural stimulation, meaning how creative are the genres that an individual artist is associated with, has a high correlation with our measure of their novelty, of song novelty. We also have cultural stimulation and social stimulation, right? You tend to perform with people who come from your genre. That's not always the case, but that tends to skew that way. So it's not surprising to see those there. Network size correlated with social recombination, right? The more people you are playing with, the likelihood you're going to get access to more and different recombinatory materials from those different collaborators. So that's the correlation matrix. As far as our modeling strategy, pooled cross-sectional OLS. We have run analyses with artist fixed effects, but really we're interested in differences by artists differences across artists as they move across time and move through time, and they're putting out new songs with different performers. Now, we do control for prior creativity as a means of capturing that individual endowment. Not even done yet. That individual endowment, but the idea is what's going on as there's this dynamic network and dynamic movement through different genres and the different access that an artist has. We do cluster the standard errors by artists. All the key theoretical variables.
What is that number?
That's the number of songs in a data set. Key theoretical variables are z-scored for comparability. And again, this is still relatively early. In fact, Eric, my co-author, sent me these results like last week. So we're looking at linear effects, curvilinear, and some interactions. And then extensive robustness checks. I'm not going to walk you through any of these today, but these are all the different things we're looking at to make sure that the results that we're getting are actually pretty robust to our different specifications. So what do the results look like? Our key IVs, and you see the 2x2 represented here. This is recombination. This is genre material you have access to. This is the inspiration of either your collaborators or the genres you're part of. And you can see what, like 13 times greater influence of genre influence. What does that mean? It means that an artist's ability to be creative or not is really heavily determined, unsurprisingly perhaps, by the genres that they're a part of. how much they can push the boundaries or not. What's permitted in that given ecosystem as a function of the other artists in it, of audience expectations, what do critics and gatekeepers want. That has a massively outsized influence on how creative an artist can be at a given point in time. Okay, what else is significant? So, female artists, and we've seen that. I have another whole project that's looking at this. Female solo artists are between female solo artists, male solo artists, and bands. Female artists are consistently putting out the most novel work. We're trying to figure out what's going on there. Classical and jazz, unsurprisingly, more likely to be novel. Prior creativity of the focal artist certainly has an influence on future creativity. If an artist is charting or major label, unsurprisingly, they're going to have less novelty in their songs, right? They're trying to appeal to a broader audience. The number of genres spanned. So the recombinatory material that an artist feels free like they can work with also is leading to greater novelty. Okay, so those are the linear effects. Questions, comments, hate mail, what do you got? Good, okay. As far as the curvilinear, so this is looking at just the linear and square term of each of these independent variables, the key independent variables. And the expectation that we had, at least beforehand, would you'd see sort of, the curvilinear inverted U. Not a lot of minimal influence, low creativity coming from that source of influence is going to be harmful. There's going to be some sweet spot, and then too much is likely to be overload. Okay, so the corners here are sort of what we'd expect. What's interesting are these, right? Cultural recombination. So again, if you don't have a lot to work with from the genres that you're a part of, right? Okay, then you're able to be creative. Not entirely sure what's going on there. It dips, right? And so when you're kind of at the mean, you're probably pulling from the standard genres, which means you're fairly boxed in. But then as you actually get access to more unique and different genre recombinatory material from the people that are in your genres, it actually enables you to be more creative. That's kind of the ex post story there. And this is fundamentally linear. Social stimulation. How creative are the people you're performing with? The more creative they are, the more creative you're likely to be. Okay? We're still working on what exactly is going on. Yes, Samir, please give me an answer.
Let me answer that. You alluded to models with artist effects. Just curious how the results change.
They do flip around, they do move around, I should say, not flip around. They do move around a little bit, but it mostly has a compressing more than
the prior slide, that story still holds up.
Yeah, so I mean, across basically every specification, this tends to be what we see. Obviously, the magnitude is going to shift, but we see as the creativity, the creative boundaries of a genre, increase, the artist's creativity is going up. So really, if you think about contextually, where is it that you're performing, and who else in that genre is performing, is really setting the stage for what you can and cannot do. Okay, and obviously you can think of like the academic analogy of that. Right, some fields where they're lower paradigm, the novelty of what you can do, it tends to be greater. Where they're high paradigm, you're kind of narrowed in. Think about what that analogously might look like.
Just thinking about the process by which artists I know it's very difficult to get it.
Yeah. So it's interesting because most of them, as they're coming up, they're not thinking about selecting into a genre. They kind of, this is what they like, this is what they put out, and then a label will kind of be like, you're close enough here. And that's what your style is going to be. Therefore, and so you've got the institutional factors, right? You've got then the audience factors of expectations, and then there is, of course, some motivation, right? If you're somebody like Bob Dylan, you can make that switch. Not a lot of artists end up having that level of freedom necessarily, right? They alienate audiences, so you have to have a certain level of stature, a certain level of prominence before you can make that kind of switch. But yeah, I do think that there's a lot of intrigue to explore there. Yeah.
To make sense of the creativity measure, visually, you have that clap. Is there a difference when we're looking at the measure when someone, say, is a rock artist and really push the rock boundary very high? So on the graph, it would be just like a little corner place, versus someone decided to say, I want to go into the folk space a little bit. So take a step back from the rock place and go into the recombination space with folk. Does it it feels like the output measure, the creativity is kind of like it's nurturing that recombination a little more than the pushing my own genre's boundary a little. How do you make sense of that?
So
Does that make sense?
I think, what would you expect, I guess, to be the outcome? Like, so you're talking about an individual artist who wants to experiment individually with another genre versus like with a nearby genre versus an artist who says, I want to push the boundaries of my existing genre. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes, like because it feels like the creativity measure is largely capturing the recombination part. But what if it's not like going into the space where recombination is possible? It's just like the outside of the club.
Can you give me like just an illustrative example?
I would imagine, let's say there are like 3 dimensions of music, the pitch, the speed, and the
Sure.
loudness. And then instead of saying like, let me recombine this, I push it to a place where the tempo is extremely fast and nobody has ever done.
I see what you're saying. So we do right now we're rerunning because so for each song we're recalculating every time you run a new thing, but we're actually looking at within genre comparisons. So that should better get at that, right? Because then it's looking at difference just from the other songs in the genre as opposed to the whole set. So that should help push that. We've also done there were earlier in an earlier version of this, we did like a nearest neighbor as opposed to an average. It didn't change a whole lot. So, and some of that, I'm not entirely sure what to attribute that to, and we sort of stopped going down that path. But I think that formulation probably gets at what you're talking about. Both of these, first looking at within genres, so that's going to really show a difference of, okay, if I'm just comparing songs to the prior songs in the genres that I'm performing in, if I'm pushing on something that's unique for this particular genre, that should pop up as being more novel. So I don't have the answer for that yet, but it is something we're looking at like right now.
The reason I say it is because I feel like if the creativity output is prone to the recombination, then the story for that, of course, it makes sense that the coach and female artists, maybe they're more marginalized, so it's easier for them to move personally around like different genres.
Yeah, I mean, I think that within genre DB should help. It's not necessarily going to solve it, but I think that should help us be able to answer that a little bit more directly. Yeah. Okay. So curvilinear, and then interactions. So first, all of the interactions, anytime we have cultural stimulation, again, remember, this is a massively outsized influence. Anytime you put that into a interaction, you see lines that really don't convert. It really outweighs everything else by so much. So that in and of itself is interesting. Even if it's significant, you can see that simply being high in cultural stimulation is just always going to be beneficial and better. Okay. But what we see is within spheres, meaning this is about the collaborative sphere interacting, recombination, stimulation. This is about the cultural sphere interacting, the two mechanisms. That we see a substitution effect. Okay, so the recombination, again, the material you have access to, and stimulation, the inspiration that you have access to, substitute for each other within spheres. Having more of one tends to reduce the marginal benefit of the other. Okay, so they're kind of with my collaborators, if they're more inspiring and have been more creative in the past, it kind of takes the place of what they have access to. You can imagine that those two are that kind of makes sense intuitively, right? The same within genre, okay? So there's that story within sphere. As far as what's going on within mechanism, so social and cultural recombination are complementary, meaning diverse collaborators, diverse genre peers, right, reinforce each other's positive effect on novelty, right? Breadth of exposure compounds across spheres. So again, if you are dealing with social recombination, again, what do my direct collaborators have access to as far as genre material, and then what do the people in the genres that I perform with, what other genres are they pulling from? That is going to lead to more recombinatory material that I can work with, and that's going to be beneficial. Across stimulation, there was no significance in the interaction between the two. And then as far as looking cross-sphere, so social recombination, what is it that my collaborators are bringing to the table? And cultural stimulation, how free am I in my genres to be creative or not? They are trade-offs, okay? Collaborative diversity becomes less productive, right? The diversity of the material that my collaborators bring to the table is less productive as genre-level creative stimulation increases. Meaning, or said more distinctly, genre peers, when genre peers are already pushing creative boundaries, the marginal value of diverse collaborators is diminished. Okay? Now, trying to take these results and create some unified theory, yeah, we're not there. But this is kind of what we're working with, and what we're talking about is trying to figure out, okay, what's going on as far as these different cells are concerned, that we can say something meaningful about where creative inspiration is taking place. So summing these up, we have some evidence of unique effects of recombination and stimulation as sources of creative influence across both spheres. So unsurprisingly, each of these sources of creative inspiration is going to have some influence, obviously to varying magnitudes. Cultural stimulation, by far the most powerful predictor of song novelty. The creative energy and constraints of genres dominates, far beyond any other influence. Female artists are consistently generating more novel songs, which is another interesting thing. We keep seeing that pop up. Of course, there's sharp asymmetries and the curvilinear effects, and there's going to be some trade-off between the sources of influence. Right, the mechanisms substitute within spheres, but can complement across the spheres. Trying to take that and make sort of a distinctive, a singular distinctive statement has eluded us thus far. But the bottom line is, in general, too much material becomes difficult to work with. It's not a more creative input is just going to sort of linearly or even exponentially increase. There's going to be a ceiling, unsurprisingly. Yeah.
It's about the plans of say in order circles really generating for your families, you have the producers and like composers and the musicians involved in the song production, or you just business.
So we include and so that's separate paper and analysis that we're working on. We are looking at who their collaborative network is and what they look like. And if you follow anything in the music industry, it'll tell you that like, while female artists are represent somewhere in between like 1 in 6 and 1 in 8 musicians in the music industry. At the producer level, it's like 1 in 50 or something. And so there's interesting like dynamics about the fact that no matter where they are in the industry, women are a minority from gender perspective, certainly. And so when you look at who they're collaborating with, they're almost always collaborating musicians, producers, whatever, with males. And so we're, from a network perspective, network diversity, they have that access, but we're also controlling for what those other people have done previously. And so that we take that into account. And so even when considering those things, they're still generally showing up as putting up more puzzle.
That's very interesting thing too. Another thing I'm thinking about is whether this is there. Also, like whether they are the creators of the novel something like they're just performing sing.
Yes. What's interesting is for the most part, since the Beatles, like the Beatles were among the first kind of write and perform their own music. There were others, but like they were kind of the first notably that did it often. For the most part, people depends on genre, right? Some people are playing standards and they're not the ones writing it, they're just performing. A lot of musicians in that data set tend to be performing their own songs. Again, it's not 90%, but it's also not like 40%, somewhere in as far as percentage of musicians that are performing songs that they themselves wrote, or were at least part of the writing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what are our implications here? Well, obviously we're still working on this, but we're trying to expand our empirical and just general explanatory mechanisms of creative influence, right? Ideally, a more holistic perspective, yes, but frankly, we think that 2x2 framework is an interesting way for people that study creative influence to start to think about this and bringing these different literatures together into some sort of unified perspective. Influential relations need not be captured by direct ties. Anybody that's studied sociology for more than a second knows that that's easy to believe, but how can we actually capture that in an empirical way? Not always been the easiest to do. Obviously, there are new mechanisms and ways of capturing that, and we're trying to be a part of that conversation. Thus far, no single generalizable mechanism. Looks like there's different mechanisms working with different forms. And then, of course, our measures based on algorithmically generated features they're still biased, but they're removing like inter-rater bias and able to capture something that is at least, subject to the same biases across all of the ways in which those acoustic features are generated. And we also can, capture the full landscape of creative output, not just recognized hits. What has been a challenge for us, and I've been working on this type of data for over a decade, is getting access to any meaningful data around performance. Yes, you've got the charts, but that's a very, very small subset of what music is out there. Getting access to any kind of revenue or sales data beyond sort of a bit here and a bit there has proven itself to be quite challenging. Yeah. Sorry?
Sorry.
It's okay. You can fire away. I'm just about done.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. So limitations and next steps, right? We're obviously not getting at the micro mechanisms within each cell, but we're starting to get closer to that. Like I said, don't have a singular theory to explain all of these results. At this point, we're focused on acoustic features. I have other papers where we look at lyrics and use large language models and the like to look at lyrical differentiation as well. We aren't looking at production value. We're not looking at visual identity. We're really just focusing on the acoustic attributes at this point. The two spheres that we're using are certainly not exhaustive, right? You can argue that organizational influence, right? Labels and major or minor or independent or niche or whatever. Also geographic influence, right? Performing in Nashville versus performing in Los Angeles versus New York versus Tokyo, right? There could be influence stemming from the geographic scene that you're a part of. And at this point, it's obviously a production side story exclusively. It's going to stay that way for now. Future directions, continue to unpack the mechanisms, trying to figure audience evaluations of market outcomes. I don't think that's necessarily going to be specifically for this project, but something I'm sort of constantly interested in. And then looking at evolution over careers, right? If you think about a Dylan or a Madonna, just to use the two examples that I used in the paper, in the presentation, right? What goes on as far as where they're drawing their inspiration from? And as they've been around longer and been more popular, are they pulling from more random and diverse sources of influence and inspiration, or are they narrowing? And what's going on as far as their own creativity is they have fewer and fewer constraints from audiences and from labels who let them do more of their own thing over time. I think that's kind of an interesting puzzle to start to look at too. That's all I got for today. Happy to answer questions, and thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah.
You interviewed artists and like I tried to go like anecdotes about this. I had an interesting conversation with these artists.
Yeah.
We were talking about more difficult now as an artist to make novel music because you kind of have this like old music that's existed before. And that was kind of her take as well. It's like not only is it more difficult because I know like I'm going to German funk from the 1970s.
Yep.
So into trap, like hip hop.
Yep.
But trying to figure out like what's complicated specifically by finding the same voice.
Yeah.
So I'm curious.
So not any particularly like famous or successful artists. I mean, I have some friends who are actually done quite well for themselves who I've just talked to about this, and I sort of show them after they ask about like what's it looked like over time, and they're like, okay, that makes sense, and what do you think has happened since 2000, and it sort of kicked up a bit, and then you can imagine it's kind of flattened out or even dropped as far as like the novelty. And the people that I've talked to say that a lot of it, the creativity now stems from, can you find that unique sweet spot that does pull from these different things? And it's not that they're the first ever to do it, but they have their own voice and their own story and their lyrical approach. And so they feel like, yes, it's harder to distinguish yourself, but if you find that kind of unique, authentic dangerous word, like niche and voice, that you can actually stand out in some ways more. And so that's kind of how they think about it. Not that they're striving to be, create a sound that nobody's ever heard before, but can they find a perspective, a voice, a lyrical approach that combines with music that probably is not the most novel sounding, but is interesting enough and unique enough that they can kind of chart their own territory a little bit. Again, that's anecdotal. That is by no means exhaustive, but that's kind of what they've said to me. Yeah.
But 10-year rolling window is to compare for like genre cycles live that kind of may not work. But a lot of technological shifts that happen, and you already mentioned about Spotify or iTunes, I think before, but it's just reminding me about like Daft Punk or Radiohead and the experiments with electronic sounds, how it's like totally changed, but also the melody and what they've been addressing with lyrics and stuff. But in cultural moments, like events in society, and I think you mentioned in the end that would be something to look at. It's like what else correlates, because I think artists a lot responding to what's going on. That's why a lot of songs of Madonna is gay pride anthems. So I think the poetry of artists and specific cultural events, like it would be interesting to see correlation. Because creativity, it's never done like, many done like kind of they just close in the studio and do their thing.
Yeah.
But it's also because you already mentioned they work in teams, they have producers and stuff, and a lot of that beyond just like sometimes one-offs like outliers and genius things.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's just really going into like what's going on in society.
Yeah. So there is work in sort of the music history field that looks at those kinds of things, like how does what's going on in the economy influence what music becomes popular or what movies become popular, or right. That's a little bit outside of our scope, obviously here, and sort of for me in general. It's related but different. I have a project with a professor where I used to work at INSEAD, Spencer Harrison, who does a lot more qualitative work, where we're looking at how artists incorporate what's going on in their personal lives. So like we look at breakup albums, and basically what's going on is they sort of break the wall between their sort of artistic persona and their personal persona. And there's all this data that we have matching qualitative with a lot of the quantitative that I have, that breakup albums tend to perform a lot better. They tend to be things that audiences latch onto more. And so we have a qualitative model for why this tearing down the barrier between artistic and personal persona leads to these great outcomes. And then what you see is the first album after breakup albums tends to be a flop for the most part. And then you have the second album after the breakup album, which is we're getting back to the basics. What is it that made us, and they sort of reintroduce a new artistic persona that goes back to where they were before. And so we can actually chart this. And so it's not pulling in what's going on sort of broadly, but how artists are kind of working with the things that are going on in their personal life and how that influences their artistic output, which I think is kind of cool. Yeah.
So a lot of this takes as a baseline the idea of competence. And so in some ways, there's sort of creativity and competence can lead to novelty. I'm curious what would happen, because we do have a lot of incompetence in the sort of digital realm.
Yeah.
If you were to introduce incompetence, do you think there would be some perturbations to this very interesting material you presented here?
Introduce incompetence how?
Just GarageBand things that are uploaded to
So in theory,
anything that my bands have ever recorded.
Okay. Can't say I'm familiar with your oeuvre, but but so I think it's interesting because you could make an argument, and we haven't looked too much at this. I looked at the Billboard charts, but that's not, you could argue that there's some incompetence, but that's a different story. I think you could make an argument that sort of self-published GarageBand, punk, whatever, in some ways could introduce more novelty because they're not confined by the constraints of music theory and of melody and things like that. You could also argue that incompetence actually is a regression to the mean. because if I don't have enough competence to test and understand that, like, yes, I can break these boundaries, but because I understand what's expected and what's not, that I'm just basically shooting straight down Main Street. So, I don't know. I think my guess based on that would probably be binary. You got a bunch of bands who just like are making noise that have no they're completely unsituated in the existing music, and then a whole bunch of bands that sort of blend with the mean because nothing is unique or interesting about them. That would be my working hypothesis without having dived specifically into that. But yeah, that's an interesting perspective, especially from the angle of incompetence. And then you could argue like what then goes on as you introduce AI music, right? And musicians who don't, right, and who don't have musicological competence, but they can use the tools that are there. There was an AI generated song that Rick Beato, if anybody's interested in music, like there's a guy on YouTube named Rick Beato. He was a session guitarist. He's just an incredible mind on musicianship and music theory and like the history of popular music. And he was looking at Suno, I think is the tool that AI generates music. And he created a song. He like fed what he wanted the artist to look like and the genre, and he then put it out and like YouTube it, just like millions of views. And it was actually like, I listened to it, pretty good song. And so it's interesting, like when somebody who has the competence can direct the creation of the AI music, that leads to something. Whereas if like somebody who just has very limited musicological knowledge and historical knowledge is trying to generate something, they're going to probably hit them, pop charts, if that's what they're familiar with, would be my guess. But it's an interesting perspective on this. Yeah.
Thinking of your graph of the creativity going down in the 1980s and back up, this is based on like US top 100, right?
Nope, that's all of the stuff in our data.
Is it all global?
It's global.
For Spotify, and from going back to Spotify's from.
I mean, yeah. So EchoNet's data, actually, there were songs in there that go back to like the 1920s. We cut it out. So 1955 is like the introduction of rock and roll. It's the first time a DJ in Cleveland used the word rock and roll. So we started there. But the data from there onward, it skews Western, Anglo, et cetera, but it's global.
And then this creativity metric that Spotify gave to each one of these songs.
Nope, it's our creativity metric. It's the features that we use. So basically using our novelty measure.
Okay.
So across all of the songs. Now, as you might imagine, like the number of songs that we have kind of goes like this year over year. So you get more songs as you move forward in our data set. But yeah, the chart on our measure over time is coming from our novelty measure based on.
And by decade, how much is global versus non? Does it get more global?
Yes, although I couldn't give you specifics.
That would really impact it, right? Like if most of your data sets American or northern based for 60s, 70s, 80s,
yeah,
and then suddenly you're doing a novelty against a global economy, and the creativity measure is not a measure of user creativity, it's a measure of potentially a global adjustment to the music. But that would without the breakdown of like where we're getting the music from where under how many per a decade or per a year, that creativity measurement seems really challenging to make an argument.
Okay. Yeah, I would need to look at the specifics over time. I'm
comparing 60s rock and roll with wheel, then I suddenly add French and Italian, Spanish, and then I add Southeast Asia.
Yep.
I mean, of course the creativity is going to get bigger because the music genres, on different even sonic scales, if I'm looking at music from China or Southeast Asia. So of course the sonic space is going to get more creative.
It is, and I know because I looked at this, like things like there's a big 70s Japanese jazz scene. And so that is in the data set. So like things that you're seeing, so it is global. Now, is that like variance versus specifics is going to make a difference? And I couldn't tell you off the top of my head the number by data or by decade. So I'll need to figure that out. But I mean, this was whatever Spotify had access to in 2013, which has expanded dramatically since then. However, it was pretty exhaustive at the time, and again skews Western, but had additional music.
I mean, it's such a skewing, I mean, fundamentally, it's only 30 or 40% of the data is now global by the 80s, they're comparing to all US. It's 90% the 60s or 70s, or it's comparing apples to oranges in terms of. So I think that chart, has a. I'm not sure if that's the case, we don't know, then what can we say about creativity right now? I'm not, And I will add that, like, also it would strike me that, like, one of the concerns or challenges might be, like, if it's very US oriented from 60s, 70s, 80s. Like by the 80s, you have 80% of the global market is controlled by 8 music companies. So you have incredible consolidation of the market with the rise of DVDs and CDs, etc. So then today is the first 3 decades, and it's mostly American, just to have a assumption for briefly. What degree has it just been a metric of market consolidation by the industry and the labels, as opposed to a measure of creativity if they're under deconsolidation? And we see that, like, in our TV networks now. What we see on US television is very, very narrow, as we've had deep market consolidation in the newspapers too. As a vein of what we actually get as news in the US has gotten very, very narrow. So it strikes, I wonder, like, almost like in line with what is a Simpsons paradox in some way with that data too. On the bottom half of it, if it's skews much more US at the end. So I would love to know more, because I think that's really foundational.
So I mean, yes, the Hot 100 was controlled by the big labels. The Hot 100 makes up like this percentage of the overall data set, right? There's about 25,000 songs from 1958 to 2015 or 16 in the Hot 100. So if you lop off 15 years, you're looking at, I don't know, 16 or 17,000 songs out of 613,000. So I mean, yes, obviously the major labels controlled more than just the Hot 100. But I also think, given the data that we have, and I have looked at it as far as like what's coming from a major label, the percentage of major label that's in here is like 30%, maybe. Again, I don't know the breakdown by decade, but it's not overwhelmingly coming from major labels.
No, it's we also shaped by Spotify's acquisition policies over time. So that would be the other thing that would be helpful to know is what was Spotify's acquisition policies. Because the Beatles are the famous example of people trying to get rights to the Beatles or not. So there's going to be a whole set of acquisition policies that are shaping the data that I can get all of Sony, but I can't get the back label of all the great jazz labels. Then I'm going to have a huge skew of that. And then I'm like, Warner Brothers, you get global Warner Brothers.
Totally get it.
I get
totally agree. Would need to look into it. Samir, did you?
I was just thinking about alternative manufacturing. This using, but obviously in the case of text, you can think about that complexity. So how unexpected is this? She put good text.
Yes.
And I don't know, there are things like foundational models that would not allow you to get closer to the unexpectedness of data music.
So Tim Dowd has some stuff that looks at song chord structures and basically has a measure of like, okay, given sort of like 1, 4, 5, I mean, that's just the sort of classic example, how then likely are we to see like the 6 minor? And so he's done that hand coded within a given song. At this scale, I would have to give some thought to what that would look like, but it's something we've talked about.
How unexpected are set of songs. All that's come before.
So actually that's a good point, right? So we do look at these measures on a year. We also look at a time window of a single year. Now, again, you may just be comparing within that year to what else was popularly released or major label released, but it should, and especially if we start doing the genre, we are doing the genre specific, like looking at that window more narrowly, it should tell us a little bit more that doesn't avoid this issue, but it hopefully sort of curbs the concern as much.
Thank you. Very interesting. one question that I had is whether you are sort of looking maybe for the future beyond the individual. So at least as far as I'm very ignorant in music, but as far as I know, let's say in literature, sometimes an artist breaks out of the given conventions and is very original.
Yeah.
And then it converges with other, let's say, original artists, and they form a new genre in which they start making their own, let's say, conventions.
Yep.
And they like their interaction creates a new, let's say, normal in some sense.
Yeah. So like stuff on scenes and things like that, I think is super interesting.
Right.
I mean, I have an empirical paper that looks at what's going on in the market as far as like variance in sounds and variance in lyrics and when genres are therefore more likely to pop up. And it's like when you see convergence along in sounds and diversity in lyrics is actually what is like the precursor to now seeing new genres pop up. So we actually looked at exactly this of where is there convergence and where there's variance and when is there likely then to see new genres and subgenres arise. It's not exactly the same thing, but I think the intuition is kind of similar there.
Yeah, and so just another short question also in the direction of what Tim was saying, like if you're sort of looking at the reception side, so originality, because at least in my another study we saw that there is this sweet spot that you mentioned also in different kinds of reception between how extreme you can go and how much you can break.
Yeah.
So if you're also sort of looking, let's say, the reception level, whether it has something to do with the creativity level.
Yes. Yep. There's another project on that. It is a sweet spot, as you might imagine. So yes. I think we're aligned. Yeah.
I'm curious. I think you had like gender myth, right? So, but were there any other like identity related dimensions? Because I'm thinking specifically of like times when an artist, like actually the first idea I think was Well-Known Sex, Old Town Road.
Yeah.
But then there was also the Little Uzi Vert, like rock song that I think is revival. There's an interview the other day of Jack Harlow, more black. Making more black music. So yeah, curious about that and the influence of like racial identity. Both the genre itself, this is a predominant black genre, let's say, and the artist stepping into that being perceived as.
Yeah. So actually the paper, the gender differences paper that we've struggled to find sort of like theoretical traction that explains the various results. And so one thing we're looking at right now is, are you an anomaly or like, are you basically underrepresented in that particular, like, are you a non-American artist in a predominantly American genre? Are you a woman in a predominantly male-dominated genre? Are you a racial minority in a, other race, dominant? And so that's what we're starting to look into. I don't have anything specific yet. In the paper about new genres arising, we actually look at, I think, I'm going to forget now it's the specifics, but basically show that that racial minorities are more likely to be the first to pop up in new subgenres. So they're kind of leading the subgenres that pop up. Don't quote me on that. It's in the paper. I don't remember the specifics because we read a bunch of different analyses, but I'm pretty sure that was it. So yes, trying to get at other identity related ways in which outsiders are more likely to be the introducers of novelty, for sure. Yeah. I'm cognizant of time at 1:30. I don't know, Tim, what's our story here?
Well, so we've got probably another 15 minutes, but this is reserved for you to actually sing.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
No. There's time for some more questions.
Sure.
But we probably have to be out of here. Lily, are you thinking?
Yeah, you just need 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah.
We've got another 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay, there's a couple questions, and I'm continuing to lose body weight to sweat, so it's all good.
We all.
Yeah, thanks for this. That was really thought provoking. Great. A lot of fun work that goes into this. Speaking of the data set, I always kind of get this feeling that the echo nest kind of backs us into a corner because it's available. It's a lot of data.
Yeah.
And it's obviously important stuff to know about the song. But there's a sense that you can see it's also engineered to keep people on Spotify or to curate a nice data set, or a nice listening experience. But I was just curious if you see a need and an opportunity to move away from that feature set for songs, and how you would do it if you could. which might involve downloading a million songs and processing them all.
Yeah.
But also if you just have gotten any intuition from this kind of analysis of like, are there some features that just aren't that important for what your creativity and these kind of analyses you're currently doing?
Yeah. So a couple of answers to that. I have had some conversations with, there's a music lab at University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, and they're doing some music information retrieval that is quite different from what EchoNest is doing. His name is Xavier, I forget his last name. Anyway, he's running a lab there that does this. Sorry?
Is it long twice?
Mm-hmm. And so we talked to them about that. Nothing specifically has materialized yet. Is an engineer to give a nice listening experience? I mean, it's a machine learning algorithm that's focused on trying to like you can make the arguments, trying to just capture what's going on and along metrics that people are attuned to, as opposed to other. There's any number of features you could argue are connected to the musical, the song and the musical listening experience. So they've obviously, this is not the full set of attributes that even the EchoNest created, let alone what Spotify now uses. We tried to do some factor loading stuff. There was not a lot that suggested one version. So actually loudness is the one that doesn't seem to matter much, and it seems to be highly variable because it's weird as to whether and I actually talked to one of the guys at EchoNest, and he's like, it's not capturing like the loudness of the audio track. It's capturing something meaningful about the amplitude of what's going on. And that turns out not to matter a whole lot. Beyond that, actually, nothing really stood out. And there's certainly nothing ex ante theoretically that should suggest this set of features versus that is going to make a demonstrable difference. So the short answer is not really. The longer answer is I'm working with the Deezer data set that I have and looking at skipping and abandonment behaviors on songs. And is it the introduction of novelty? Is the introduction of the play? Is the next song a function of what you've recently played, and is it similar to that or different from that? And does that lead to the likelihood of your skipping or even abandoning the platform altogether? And then looking at all sorts of recall mechanisms as far as like what is a listener's taste likely to be, and then something about the introduction of novelty or familiarity that leads them to make decisions about how they feel about that song. We're also looking at that relative to the different features to see if there's something that's driving that. I don't have answers for you yet. I was actually just on a call yesterday talking about that project, but I think we're trying to get it a little bit more. How do people think about being exposed to something new or something familiar? And then what do they do as a reaction to that? And can we then link that to any of the features here or other attributes of the music in general? Not sure if that answers your question, but that's kind of how.
No, that was great. I made a note of that you had the Deezer data set. You were working with that too, but then I forgot to ask about it. Yeah. I mean, I just think, like, intuitively, I always wonder, like, what does he really do? It does affect the timbre of the instruments that are playing in the key. So that's something, but that's sort of for me, it's a subliminal level because I don't have absolute pitch. But from Spotify's point of view, if you play two songs adjacent to each other that are in somewhat clashing keys, maybe that does bother people. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. And I also have this very bizarre project with John Levy Martin, who's a sociologist at Chicago, where we're playing 10-second clips of songs and asking people to just rate how the descriptors, tactile descriptors of the music. And basically in the pre-testing, what we're doing is we're just putting it on a 2x2 and seeing what features and what kinds of songs end up getting clustered together as, is this song slippery? Is this song pointy? Is this song? And so trying to get at other descriptors across different cultures of how people kind of take sonic attributes and think about them in more tactile and tangible ways. Totally out of left field, but trying again to come at different ways in which people are processing musical information. All right. Thank you, Samir, for having invited me and made the recommendation to Tim. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Tim, for having me. Thank you for coming, and happy to chat more at the round table we're headed to now. Thanks very much.